Okay, so turning to the introduction. So instrumental variables is a very handy approach when we have a whole bunch of different things going on at once and we aren't able to set up an RCT, and so we want to be able to nonetheless speak to causality. The issue with having a whole bunch of different, possibly confounding variables is that even if we adjust for the observables, we might not be able to create a good estimate because there's a whole bunch of other unobservable variables that might actually be influencing our result. In the case of the IEP reading, they talk about a few situations in terms of surveys and how people can opt out of filling out the survey. So even though we've put them into the test set, into the treatment set, what happens if they don't fill out the survey? And so this is an example of where there could be some confounding going on. We can't do an RCT for various reasons. Perhaps they're ethical, perhaps perhaps we don't have the money, perhaps we don't have the time. And so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to find some variable, and this is where it's going to be the eponymous, the instrumental variable. And the instrumental variable is going to have two characteristics, and these are critical. Firstly, it has to be correlated with the treatment variable. However, at the same time, it has to be not correlated, it has to be independent of the outcome. And so you can sort of see that if the treatment variable is correlated with the outcome, and we're requiring that the instrumental variable is correlated with the treatment, then you can see why it might be so difficult for us to find an instrumental variable, because the instrumental variable has to be not correlated with the outcome by itself. Now, if we can find such an instrumental variable, if we can find such a variable, then this is going to solve our problems. And the reason it solves these problems is because of this trade-off. Because the only way that the instrumental variable can be affecting the outcome is through its effect on the treatment. And so we look at how much the treatment variable is affected by the instrumental variable. And so let's just say we change the instrumental variable 5%, and then the treatment variable varies by 5%, and then we see further on that this affects the outcome by 5%. Then we can have some idea that perhaps, well, it's actually there is some relationship going on, because the only reason that the treatment variable varied was because we affected the instrumental variable. It wasn't anything else that was going on. So you can see how this instrumental variable is going to do the job of randomization for us. And so that's fantastic. It's really nice. Really handy when we can identify them. But it's hard to find. So it's hard to find these variables because of these requirements that they have to meet. Now, the go-to example here is smoking. Now, these days we all sort of know that if you smoke, then your chance of getting cancer and a whole bunch of other associated health issues is worse. In general, we can say that if you smoke, then it's fairly likely that later on your health is going to be worse than if you didn't smoke. We know that. But it wasn't always so clear. And the reason that it wasn't so clear is because smoking is correlated with a whole bunch of other variables. And so, for instance, smoking rates tends to be inversely correlated with education rates. And so is it actually that smoking is causing worse health outcomes, or is it that education is causing worse health outcomes? It seems silly these days, but it's just an example to show you why it's so difficult actually in the real world to isolate causal effects. As an aside, it was actually our old friend, the geneticist Fisher, who spent quite a lot of time trying to debunk the link between smoking and worse health outcomes. But yeah. So now, obviously, in an ideal world, we would just run an RCT and we'd be done with it. But you can very easily see the issues with this in terms of a smoking situation. It's probably fairly unethical to force a whole bunch of people to smoke and force a whole bunch of people to not smoke. It's going to take a long time because if you just have one cigarette, you typically don't see a reduction in your health outcome, immediately. It takes years, and so it's going to take a long time to run this RCT, and so then we'd get a whole bunch of people dropping out, people joining in. So it's going to be difficult to run RCTs for a bunch of reasons. And so instead, we might try and look for a variable that is correlated with smoking rates, but by itself is not correlated with lung cancer or worse health outcomes. Now, the go-to example is tax rates. And you may wonder, well, that's sort of a little bit weird. And if that's your reaction, then that's probably good. That's probably the sign of a good instrumental variable. But the reason that tax rates might be so useful is because tax rates are going to affect the amount that people smoke, which in itself will then affect their health outcomes. But tax rates, of course, by themselves aren't going to affect health outcomes. And so we typically look to tax rates and other sort of policy responses and look at their effect on cigarettes. And then we look at the effect of cigarettes on health outcomes. And so you can see here that tax rates or whatever, whatever similar sort of policy response you're putting in, they're not going to be correlated with lung cancer by themselves or worse health outcomes by themselves, other than through their effect on cigarette smoking. And hence, if we vary the tax rate, then we can, and we feed that through our mechanism, we can be fairly confident that any result is an actual effect of cigarettes on health. As an Australian, this is very close to my heart because we, a few years ago, put in place these very stringent laws around cigarette smoking, and so all of the packaging around cigarettes has to be very plain. There's all these health warnings, and so there was a whole bunch of policy responses. And so as an Australian, this example is very close to my heart. So we're going to see plenty of examples of how we actually implement instrumental variables, but just to give you a very brief overview, what we're going to do is we're going to regress tax rates on cigarette smoking. So this is one way. This is the first way we're going to get to it. And so we're going to get some coefficient. Then, in a completely separate regression, we're going to regress tax rates on lung cancer. And again, we're going to get some coefficient, some coefficient on the instrumental variable. We then take the ratio of those two coefficients, and that is our effect. One way to describe this is to call it the Wald estimate, but there's a variety of other people who call it a variety of other things. Now, just to follow on from Gelman and Hill, there's a whole bunch of assumptions that we're going to make. And so using their language, we have a few of them here. The ones that I'm going to focus on are the need for the correlation between the instrumental variable and the treatment variable. So in our case, in this smoking case, it's going to be a link between smoking rates, and taxes on smoking, and the exclusion restriction, which is saying that there is no relationship between smoking tax rates, between the tax rates on cigarettes and lung cancer or worse health outcomes. To finish up the introduction, I really recommend Scott's book in terms of instrumental variables. But what has happened? And I'll just quote from this book. And what has happened here? So in the lead up to this quote, Scott has talked about the cholera person. So Jon Snow, the person who discovered that cholera is waterborne. And so he explains, well, I mean, it's obviously not possible to randomly allocate clean and dirty water. That's completely unethical, and in any case, it's just not possible. And so instead, what we need to do is we need to find some variable that is going to trick the data, so that we can work as if it had been randomly allocated. And so when we're doing A/B testing, we are tricking our data. It's just that this random roll of the dice or whatever is tricking the data so that it's not correlated, so that the outcomes aren't correlated with any of our other variables. We can't roll the dice in this case, and so we need to find some other variable that's going to roll the dice for us. And so in the case of cholera and Jon Snow, the example that Scott talks about is in the City of London. There were a whole bunch of different companies that were providing water. It's not like these days where there's just one company who provides water. There was a whole bunch of different ones. And they got their water from different parts of the Thames, which was very, very dirty. And so it turned out that different companies had different rates of cholera. And so it's that difference that we're able to exploit, because one of the companies changed where they were getting their water from. And so in this case, if we are able to argue that all of the households are pretty much the same, but for the fact that they get their water from different company, then we could look to the difference in the rates as perhaps being something that is going to give us the evidence that we need. And so with that, with the introduction concluded, we will just turn to a brief discussion of the history of instrumental variables.